For more than 2 decades, Charlize Theron has been one of the most recognizable sex symbols in Hollywood, a figure who shaped how beauty, desire, and female power were sold to the public from the late 20th century into the early 21st century. Her image dominated magazines, red carpets, and movie screens, turning her into a global reference point for confidence, sensuality, and control. But behind that influence was a far less glamorous reality. The confidence the public admired was built alongside trauma, survival, and an industry that felt entitled to define her body before she could. Beauty became both protection and exposure, while sexuality, framed as empowerment, slowly transformed into a form of control exercised by the Hollywood system itself. This is not a story about scandal or fantasy. It is about how fame, desire, and power collide inside an industry that rewards visibility but punishes autonomy. And to understand how that collision began, we have to return to the moment when the illusion first started to crack. Long before the public knew Charlize Theron as a sex symbol or an Oscar-winning actress, her understanding of power was shaped in a place far removed from Hollywood glamour. She grew up on a remote farm in South Africa during the late 20th century, surrounded by open land, silence, and isolation. From the outside, it looked peaceful. But inside the home, control was fragile, unpredictable, and often violent. Her father struggled with alcoholism, and fear became a routine presence rather than an exception. As a child, she learned early that safety was never guaranteed. Nights were tense, voices could shift without warning. Love and danger existed in the same space. This was not a childhood defined by innocence, but by alertness. She watched adults lose control, saw authority collapse into chaos, and absorbed the lesson that power, when abused, could turn intimate spaces into threats. Even before she had words for it, her body learned what it meant to stay ready, to read rooms, to protect itself. The defining moment came when she was still a teenager. One night, the violence crossed a line that could not be ignored. Her father threatened to kill both her and her mother. In that moment, survival replaced morality. Her mother made a decision that would end one life and permanently alter another. Charlize witnessed the shooting that killed her father, a moment that did not fade with time but settled deep into her understanding of the world. Childhood did not simply end that night. Control was stripped away and replaced by something colder, sharper, and far more permanent. What followed was not collapse, but adaptation. Trauma did not make her fragile, it made her precise. She learned that dependence was dangerous and that autonomy was not a luxury but a necessity. Trust became selective. Vulnerability became measured. The idea of surrendering control, whether emotional or physical, no longer felt safe. These instincts did not disappear as she grew older. They traveled with her, quietly shaping every major decision that followed. When she left South Africa to pursue dance and later acting, she carried more than ambition. She carried an internal rule that no one else would ever fully own her body or her choices again. Even in moments where she appeared open, confident, or fearless, there was always a line she refused to cross. The public would later interpret this as strength, independence, even mystery. In reality, it was survival refined into discipline. This early loss of control explains much of what came later. It explains why she resisted being defined by others. It explains why visibility never felt like safety to her. And it explains why sexuality, when it entered her life as a public commodity, would always feel complicated. Desire, attention, and power were never abstract concepts to her. They were forces she had already seen turn destructive when left unchecked. By the time Hollywood encountered Charlize Theron, it met a woman who had already survived the collapse of authority inside her own home. The industry would try to claim her image, her body, and eventually her sexuality. But long before that happened, she had learned the most important lesson of all. Control could be taken away in an instant. And once you lose it, the only way forward is to make sure no one ever takes it from you again. When Charlize Theron arrived in Hollywood during the late 20th century, the industry read her body before it listened to her voice. She was tall, sculpted, and immediately legible to a system trained to translate female presence into desire. Casting rooms did not ask what she wanted to become, they assumed what she already was. Beauty opened doors quickly, but those doors often led to the same narrow corridor. Early attention framed her as effortless and controlled, a modern image of sensual confidence that fit neatly into magazine spreads and studio marketing. To the public, this looked like power. To the system, it was categorization. Her physicality became the headline, while ambition and craft were treated as secondary details. Roles, interviews, and photo shoots reinforced the same expectation. Sexuality was presented as her natural language, as if it were not a choice but a condition attached to her presence. What made this phase especially complex was how consent quietly blurred into compliance. Opportunities arrived wrapped in unspoken rules. To remain visible, she had to remain desirable in a very specific way. To push back meant risking silence. Hollywood did not threaten her directly. It simply rewarded repetition and withheld momentum from anything that complicated the image. The pressure to accept the definition offered was constant, polite, and difficult to name. Media attention intensified this imbalance. Images circulated faster than explanations. Old modeling photographs resurfaced without context, reminding her that once a body entered the public record, control over it became conditional. Legal boundaries proved thin. Privacy proved fragile. Visibility did not belong to the person being seen. It belonged to the audience and the institutions that mediated the gaze. This environment trained a particular kind of silence. Questions about ambition were tolerated only as long as they did not disrupt the image. Curiosity about craft was redirected toward appearance. Over time, a distortion formed. The more visible she became, the less space she had to explain herself. Sexuality filled the gaps where complexity was ignored. For someone already shaped by the cost of losing control, this imbalance was impossible to unsee. Yet awareness created distance. She recognized that sexuality, when framed by Hollywood, rarely existed as self-expression alone. It functioned as currency. It could be traded for access, momentum, and approval, but the exchange rate was set elsewhere. Desire created leverage, but it also created expectation. The more valuable the image became, the harder it was to renegotiate its meaning. She did not reject the image outright, nor did she surrender to it. Instead, she studied the system from inside. Each appearance became a calculation. Each role carried an unspoken question about how much control she was willing to trade for continued presence. The public saw confidence. What they did not see was restraint. By the end of this phase, the contradiction was fully formed. She was celebrated as a sex symbol while quietly resisting the idea that this was all she could be. Hollywood had given her visibility, but it had also clarified its terms. Sexuality could elevate her, but only if it stayed simple. Anything more complex would require confrontation. By the early 21st century, Charlize Theron had achieved what many young actresses were told to want. She was visible, bankable, and instantly recognizable. Yet that visibility came with an invisible ceiling. The same industry that praised her presence continued to offer variations of the same role, the same framing, the same expectation that desirability should remain her primary contribution. Success, as defined by Hollywood, began to feel increasingly narrow. Typecasting arrived disguised as reassurance. Studios framed repetition as strategy, suggesting that staying within a proven image was not limitation but protection. The message was subtle but persistent. Do not disrupt what already works. Do not challenge the gaze that brought you here. For many actresses, this was where ambition quietly adjusted itself downward. For her, it marked the beginning of resistance. The cost of refusing the easy path appeared immediately. Turning down roles slowed momentum. Questioning scripts complicated relationships. Choosing discomfort over familiarity introduced risk at a moment when stability seemed within reach. These decisions did not produce instant victories. They produced pauses, uncertainty, and professional friction. In an industry built on constant motion, hesitation was treated as failure. What distinguished this resistance was its restraint. There were no public declarations or dramatic exits. Instead, there was a steady pattern of choices that confused the system. Smaller roles replaced showcase performances. Characters became unstable, unflattering, and resistant to charm. Each decision weakened the image Hollywood preferred to maintain. The shift was quiet, but it was deliberate. This phase revealed the deeper mechanics of control. Hollywood rarely enforces compliance through force. It uses opportunity as leverage. Access becomes conditional. Praise becomes selective. Silence replaces rejection. As desirability grew less predictable, offers withdrew more quickly. What the industry interpreted as hesitation was, in fact, evaluation. She was learning how much she could withhold without disappearing completely. These years were not about winning visible battles. They were about mapping the terrain. She observed how quickly momentum vanished when she stopped being legible. She measured the cost of independence against the cost of compliance. Isolation clarified her priorities. Without constant reinforcement from the system, she recalibrated her definition of success. Craft replaced approval. Longevity replaced immediacy. She aligned herself with directors rather than studios, with projects rather than images. Public reaction during this period was mixed. Some questioned her direction. Others assumed momentum had stalled. Few recognized that the slowdown was intentional. She was not stepping away from power. She was preparing to redefine it. Fighting the system did not mean rejecting Hollywood entirely. It meant refusing to let it dictate the limits of her identity. Each refusal accumulated quietly, preparing the ground for a break that would eventually be impossible to ignore. The system still believed it controlled the image. What it failed to see was that the image itself was already being dismantled. The dismantling arrived quietly, without warning, leaving no room for permission or retreat. Charlize Theron stood at a crossroads that many in Hollywood never dare to approach. The image built around her was profitable, familiar, and carefully protected by the system. She was desired, recognizable, and easy to market. From the outside, this looked like a rival. From the inside, it felt like confinement. Remaining inside that frame promised safety. Stepping outside, it threatened everything she had accumulated. The decision that followed was neither impulsive nor emotional. It was strategic. She chose to dismantle the very image that had elevated her, knowing full well what that destruction might cost. When she accepted the role that would become Monster, she did not simply take on a difficult character. She agreed to erase herself as the object of desire the public had grown comfortable consuming. Weight gain, physical transformation, and deliberate ugliness were not side effects of the performance. They were its foundation. What shocked Hollywood was not just the transformation, but the intent behind it. This was not a temporary departure or a hidden experiment. It was a public refusal to remain desirable on command. The performance confronted audiences with discomfort, forcing them to look at a woman stripped of glamour, control, and approval. In doing so, it exposed the fragile contract between female visibility and value. Once beauty was removed, attention shifted. Judgment intensified. Respect hesitated. The risk was immense. If the performance failed, there would be no graceful return to the image she destroyed. Yet this was precisely the point. The destruction had to be irreversible to matter. By severing the association between her worth and her desirability, she reclaimed authority over how she would be seen or ignored. The Oscar recognition that followed did not soften the act. It amplified it. Success arrived, but on her terms, not the system ones. This shift did not lead her toward safer choices. It pushed her further into roles that resisted comfort. Characters became colder, harsher, and less interested in being liked. Power was no longer expressed through softness or appeal. It appeared through control, restraint, and refusal. The gaze that once defined her was no longer centered. Instead, she positioned herself outside it, watching the system respond. Hollywood adjusted reluctantly. The industry could celebrate transformation, but it struggled with the implications. A woman who no longer relied on desirability disrupted established hierarchies. Authority without charm unsettled familiar dynamics. The roles that followed continued this confrontation, reinforcing the idea that strength did not require invitation or approval. Destroying the image did not free her instantly. It redefined the battlefield. She was no longer negotiating visibility. She was asserting presence. The sex symbol had been dismantled, but what replaced it was not absence. It was something far less manageable. A woman no longer shaped by desire, no longer contained by expectation, and no longer interested in being legible to anyone but herself. The system could no longer rely on the image it had built. What stood in its place demanded a different kind of engagement, one rooted in authority rather than appeal. From this point forward, control would not be requested or negotiated. It would be taken. By the time Charlize Theron entered the later phase of her career in the early 21st century, the struggle was no longer about visibility. She had already dismantled the image that once defined her. What remained was a deeper question: how to exist inside a system without being shaped by it. The answer did not come through louder performances or bigger roles. It came through ownership. Becoming a producer marked a decisive shift in power. This was not a symbolic title or a vanity credit. It was a structural move that allowed her to choose stories, shape narratives, and decide which perspectives reached the screen. Control moved upstream. Instead of negotiating meaning after the fact, she began defining it from the beginning. The system that once filtered her through desire now had to engage with her authority. This autonomy extended beyond career decisions. In her personal life, she rejected traditional frameworks that often mirror industry expectations. Marriage was never treated as a requirement for legitimacy. Partnership was not framed as completion. Instead, she chose motherhood on her own terms, adopting children without attaching the decision to romantic validation. This choice was neither rebellious nor performative. It was practical, intentional, and deeply consistent with everything that came before. Motherhood did not soften her public image. It clarified it. Her body, once scrutinized as a commodity, no longer functioned as a site of negotiation. It was no longer offered for approval or interpretation. Privacy became a boundary she actively enforced rather than defended. When public attention turned toward her family, she responded with firmness rather than explanation. Identity, she made clear, was not subject to debate. What distinguished this phase was its quietness. There were no dramatic declarations or symbolic exits. Power manifested through absence, through selective engagement, through the refusal to participate in narratives that reduced her to spectacle. She moved fluidly between high-profile projects and deliberate pauses, demonstrating that relevance did not require constant exposure. Owning the system did not mean controlling Hollywood. It meant controlling her relationship to it. She no longer needed to prove seriousness, desirability, or resilience. Those battles had already been fought. What remained was choice. Choice over stories. Choice over visibility. Choice over how much of herself was made available to the public. Motherhood, autonomy, and authority converged into a single posture. One defined not by resistance, but by self-possession. The system could no longer frame her as a symbol to be consumed or corrected. She existed beyond that function. This was not an ending built on triumph. It was an ending built on stability. A woman who had learned early that control could vanish without warning chose to design a life where it could not be easily taken again. Hollywood did not grant her this position. She claimed it, quietly and completely. There is something quietly admirable about a woman who survives a system without becoming its product. At the same time, there is something undeniably sad about how much had to be endured before that survival became possible. The journey of Charlize Theron carries both emotions at once: respect for the control she built and a lingering sense of what it cost to build it. Across decades, she moved through visibility, desire, resistance, and authority. Fame offered reach, but never safety. Power arrived slowly, shaped by refusal rather than reward. What looks like confidence from the outside was often discipline formed under pressure, and autonomy earned through loss rather than privilege. This story does not glorify hardship. It simply reminds us that freedom inside Hollywood is rarely given. It is negotiated, defended, and sometimes taken quietly. If this journey stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment resonated with you the most.